Meghan, in many of our conversations, and even in some of the past videos that we've done, you've touched on the notion that artwork is often an expression of vulnerability from artists. And I thought I'd talk a little bit more about that, or want to have more of a conversation with you, because vulnerability is just one of those keywords that, and one of those topics, I won't just say keywords, but a topic, and an important topic that is frequently discussed, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in about leadership, and being people who can engage and connect with. Vulnerability is a really important characteristic, I think, at the moment. So I'd like you to just, I guess, share a little bit more about your thoughts on vulnerability, especially from an artist's perspective.
Well, I think this is a interesting topic in the sense that we tend to identify the word vulnerability as weakness. And it's not necessarily the case. It does depend on the situation. And I know that sometimes when people make comments about artwork and it's negative, it has a negative impact on the artist because they are in a vulnerable position, because they're exposing a piece of themselves. They're sharing a piece of themselves, and it feels like a direct insult on like who they are as a person. And you can feel that negative impact as the recipient. And, you know, there are statements, oh, harden up. But I don't think that's the direction we should be taking. I think it's like, okay, as an artist, why don't they understand me? And as an audience member, why don't I understand them? What is the disconnect, I think? And really investigating that vulnerable space instead of, hey, they've insulted me or insulted my work or vice versa. It's more like, wait, okay, they're coming at it from this direction and I'm coming at it from this direction. Why are we not connecting? And I think that's the direction of question we should be addressing.
I think that's a really poignant insight. Two things came to mind as you were talking, which is, one, I think, I find it interesting that why artists, why this connection between vulnerability and artists is because artists are communicating typically through artwork. I mean, visual artists, of course, are communicating through artwork. And there's no words, generally speaking, right? It's paint, it's expression, it's, in many cases, a sense of emotion that's there.
Different type of language.
Yeah, that's a different type of language. And I can understand that in some ways it's a layer, right? That is slightly deeper than words, because the reason I say that is because I think if it's words, sometimes we can argue the language or the use of it, but with something like paint and color, it's just, here's the emotion of it. But to your second point about the dialogue around that, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think vulnerability takes two, right? There is the person who is sharing vulnerability, but equally there is the audience, the recipient, to respond to that vulnerability. And there's creating space for vulnerability. It's accepting vulnerability and all the imperfections that come along with it. And then it's, to your point, having some of that dialogue around vulnerability. Because in my experience in the world of leadership or in the world of business, I have seen examples where people have been vulnerable. And even that's expressed through words, but it's not always well received.
I think this is part of the breakdown of communication. Some people are great with words, some people are great with communication, and some people aren't. And it's not a discredit, it's not insult, it's just some people are better at communication than others. And sometimes people accidentally insult other people, not knowingly. They might even be trying to give a compliment, but the way they go about it is not receive how it's intended. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to be the bridge to connect the audience and the artist and mitigate, not eliminate, because that's pretty much impossible, but mitigate the misunderstandings and try to create those connections within the workplace between the artist and audience member.
Oh, well, if I can sort of build on and just refine that a little bit further, I think, you know, in some of the stuff that we do, it's a parallel of creating that practice of acceptance, right? It's creating that practice of here, we're surrounded by people's emotions. What are we going to do about that, right? Do we quickly pass judgment on it? Or do we sort of say, oh, actually, how can I make space for this type of vulnerability? And again, there's in one of our past videos, we talk about the notion of disagreement, right? And that's not to say that people can't disagree with an opinion, but it's the relationship, it's that communication relationship, it's the acceptance in some ways of that. Because I think I sometimes think about this spectrum of vulnerability, right? That for people, especially men, dare I say, you know, there's often ego tied into like our identity, for example, right? And so for us, because again, I'm not speaking for all men, I'm just talking from my own experience. And there weren't many spaces to be able to express and talk about things like emotion. And so sometimes I think of this being small toe dips, right? And it's creating saying, well, let me be a little bit vulnerable here. Let me be a little bit more vulnerable here. Let me be a lot more vulnerable here. But that requires, in some ways, the space for people to be able to accept that showing of vulnerability. And that's something I think of as an interesting facet of this communication. What are your reflections on that?
I'm trying to. One of the things that came to mind is it's not just a gender thing, but it's also a cultural thing. There are certain cultures that tend to be a bit more reserved and not openly share opinions because it's actually frowned upon. I used to teach a lot of international students and dealt with a lot of conflict, but not in an aggressive way, but misunderstandings, not because of so much the language they were learning, which sometimes was a problem, but sometimes it was actually the cultural practices. And one culture couldn't understand why they couldn't get a direct answer from another culture, or couldn't understand why they couldn't understand them. But it wasn't really the language barrier, it was actually cultural practice. And one culture was not exposed to a certain type of behavior or approach and behavior in, say, the classroom or workspace. And the other one couldn't understand why, because their culture was a different kind of language. And one of the things I learned is with teaching the language is actually there's cultural and cultural behaviors with it. And I think touching on that and then touching on gender and adding all these layers adds to the complexity of misunderstanding. And I think the approach of trying to break down those layers to help show the vulnerability is not a bad thing, but it's just a way of making it a raw connection.
Well, I think it's facilitating that connection or facilitating that communication. Yeah. And I thank you for bringing up the point about culture, because I very much agree. I hadn't considered it. I'm aware of it, but as I was talking about my thoughts, it was a nice yes and onto that. Because you're right. I do agree that it's not purely a gender thing. And speaking as someone from a Chinese background, oh yeah, like there is definitely a lot of in China there is that trope or that tradition or culture of face, of saving face, presenting face, and that is another layer on top of that. And so everyone experiences different versions of how vulnerability might be expressed. So very much so, and even I just thought I'd do a mini case in point of like saying, for me, I shared a perspective from a place of vulnerability, of thinking, well, maybe it is a gender thing, but you also created the space to say, oh, actually, there's maybe other things that add to it.
Yeah.
And as a result of that little dialogue, I've been able to kind of update how I'm thinking about vulnerability as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
But what I think the next part of that becomes really interesting is that ultimately I think it is about connection, right? It is about that communication. And even with, say, the students that you taught and some of their cultural behaviors, it's still creating the space to encourage little bits of vulnerability to come through, to kind of share so what do you really think? And it might be, going back to my point about the spectrum of vulnerability, it might be that it is just a small little fingertip of, I'll just share this little bit.
Yeah.
But that's important. That's like a little spark to nurture in some ways. And I think that speaks to that two-way communication of, in order for people to be vulnerable, we need to create the space for it and engage with that. And hopefully by doing that, it reciprocates by people willing to be a bit more vulnerable as well.
I think it's also the speed. Some people with the little toe dip, some people are going to move a bit slower and some people are going to move faster. And neither one's right or wrong. I think it's more or less like give a little, take a little so you can meet in the middle to help bridge that communication and show, understand the vulnerability of either the viewer or presenter.
So I think if there's a takeaway from this discussion, it really is actually, it's considering that practice, the spectrum of vulnerability and the practice of vulnerability.
Yep.
And it can start with something as simple as an artwork, but equally, it's carrying that over into other areas. And there might even be small expressions of vulnerability that we don't pick up on because we may not have the practice of being able to detect what might have been a small spark of vulnerability. And so I think that's something to, that we continue to practice as we go through our lives.